Good evening, everyone, and I welcome you to our first in a series of events about diversity, equity, and inclusion. My name is Steve Safier. I'm the interim program director of the Human Capital Management Club. The Human Capital Management Program. Sometimes it feels like I work with the club, and that's a pleasure. I'll get to that in a minute before I introduce the president of our club. But it's very exciting to be able to offer this program in conjunction with two of our other programs at the Columbia School of Professional Studies: negotiation and conflict resolution, and nonprofit management. We'll be hosting a series of events over the course of the year. This is the first of 6 or 7. There may be more. And I'll also bring to your attention, just in a couple of weeks, November 12th, we'll have another event. Election hindsight is 2020. So as you've probably heard, there's an election coming up next week, and I think it'll be fascinating to look back, and I'm sure we'll all have a lot to say and think and discuss about the election to come. So why did we develop this DEI series? It's probably fairly obvious, but we're in a time of national crisis, perhaps global crisis, because of the pandemic, with the demands for racial justice. And the change that we need to occur throughout the world has to start everywhere and has to start within the walls of our organizations and institutions. We're talking about needing a cultural change, a shift in norms, equitable processes, genuine inclusion. And we thought that it would be helpful and valuable to our program and frankly to society to engage our students, engage our faculty, our alumni, those of you from outside Columbia who have chosen to join us this evening in a real discussion and difficult conversations. And we're very thrilled and pleased to be able to engage in those conversations, leaders of diversity, equity, inclusion from major companies. You'll be introduced to the panel in a moment. You've seen it in our materials. We're also very fortunate that our panel will be moderated by Dr. Cindy Pace, who's the head of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at MetLife. And we're fortunate to have Dr. Pace, Cindy, as a member of our faculty at Columbia. So we're very thrilled about that. Just one note, through Cindy's generosity, she's joining us in a panel today, even though she's without power. So you won't see Cindy's on video, but you'll hear from her. And it might be because of the power issues that might be she drops off at some point. We'll just continue, but we hope she'll be able to stay with us, and we welcome her in the panelists. So with that, the other thing I'm very excited about, as I mentioned earlier, is that this first event is being hosted by our Columbia University SPS HCM Club. It's a group of talented, committed students who come together to learn and to grow and to network and to represent our full array and cadre of talented students in the 2 years of our 2 separate cohorts in our program, in our Human Capital Management Master's program. So with that, I am delighted to introduce you to Talia Charles, the president of our HCM Club, who will kick off our event. Talia, please take it from here and welcome.
Thank you, Steve. On behalf of the Human Capital Management Club, I welcome you. Our moderator for this evening is Dr. Cindy Pace. Dr. Pace is the Global Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at MetLife. She's also a lecturer in professional development, executive education, and adjunct professor of organizational leadership at Columbia, and a professor of one of my favorite classes. I will now turn the microphone over to Dr. Cindy Pace.
Thank you, Talia and Steve, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this very important conversation on diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, the role of the diversity and inclusion officer is a hot topic right now. And we're going to dive in with what I call a game-changing panel. I want to start with someone who is not only a former boss, but a dear friend, a sponsor, and a mentor to me, and that is Elizabeth Nieto. Elizabeth is the head of Global Diversity and Inclusion for Amazon. And if you don't know who Amazon is or about the company, where have you been? We are in the world of Amazon. Thank you so much for joining us, Elizabeth, and we look forward to hearing from you. I also have on the panel with me, and you'll see there's a common theme of friendship. and connections on this panel. But I have a dear friend who I've known for over a decade, and we joined this space around the same time. And to be on a panel together talking about diversity and inclusion from the seat of being a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer is extremely touching to me. And I would like to introduce you to Ripa Rashid, who is the Managing Director and Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Cowen. Also joining me is someone who, you know how you meet people and you're just like, they're dynamic, I need to know them. That's how this next person, I met her. Really, we were, I don't even know if you remember this, Shannon, but we were walking in the airport. I think it was like the Renaissance Hotel in Atlanta, and Shannon was putting on a forum as part of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. And we got a chance to immediately talk and connect, and we said we were going to keep in touch, and we've been doing that. I'm so happy to have Shannon Schuyler, who is the Chief Purpose and Inclusion Officer at PricewaterhouseCoopers, known as PwC US. Shannon is also responsible for co-leading the largest CEO-led initiative called the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, and we'll talk more about that. Another person who I met and I immediately became friends with, I think this was last year, we were at an innovation session, and that is Allison. And Allison and I connected, and we said, listen, we have to do some stuff together. And I'm really just proud of the work that she is doing and moving forward. Allison Reedy Williamson is the Chief Inclusion Officer at Endeavor. And so what you'll notice about tonight's panel is that we have people from all different sectors. So we have Allison representing the entertainment industry. We have Shannon, who's representing professional services. We have Ripa with Cowen representing finance and asset management. And we have Elizabeth Nieto with Amazon representing everything, because Amazon is across so many sectors, and myself, Cindy Pace with MetLife. So let's jump in. Now that we've had some introductions, also, I'm not going to read long bios. So if you want to know more about our game-changing panelists tonight, their bios are at your fingertips. If you go to our website, you will be able to find out more about them. And we're going to find out more about them in this discussion this evening. But let's talk a little bit about, how Steve started off. We're in this moment of, national, global crisis. We're in a pandemic that I don't think we thought we would continue to experience. And we are also at at a critical point of understanding that people want change in terms of racial equity and inclusion. And so with that, it seems to be that the Chief Diversity Officer role has come to the forefront. As I was preparing for the panel, one of the things I read is before the pandemic, before the racial and civil unrest across the world, 63% of Chief Diversity Officers had been appointed or promoted in their roles within the past 3 years. If we fast forward to just January, going into March, Chief Diversity Officers, those roles were being looked at as, should we keep those roles? And Shannon, you have more insights that you can share about that, of really, some of the roles were on what we call the chopping block. Yet, fast forward, and we get into this inflection point when we are faced with what are we going to do after the death of George Floyd and so many others. And so now the Chief Diversity Officer role it's in the forefront. It's a hot job. And I want to start and just open it up to all of you, whoever would like to go first. why is this role important? And what is the role of a Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer?
Cindy, I'll jump in. It's Shannon, and give you a little bit of the context that you had alluded to. We were amazed that here we, over the last several years, have been working incredibly hard with many of the people that are on the call with developing CEO action for diversity and inclusion. And people were really focused on it. We have CEOs and we have boards and we have employees. We have a lot of commitment that's around there. And suddenly when end of February, March, and April came, there were several companies that decided to furlough their diversity departments. And so both their CDOs as well as their entire teams, as they were looking for and ways to keep their organizations sustainable and ways in which to continue moving forward with their business, felt like it was one of those areas that they could save some money on by not having those people there. And interestingly enough, you fast forward to a month or two later, and those same organizations were saying, oh, now I get it, right? And it was interesting because there were organizations that were committed to it, but in the hardest time that we found, a global pandemic, they were amongst those earlier groups that people said, you know, I think they're really important, but as we're starting to look at the importance level, they're behind some others. And so we're for now going to either let them go or furlough them. And then we became 2 months later in the situation where you had this horrific murder of George Floyd, which was just a culmination of murders and killings, and people were done. And they were in the midst of a global pandemic. And suddenly you had organizations that were looking to hire people, both hire people back, as well as to say, what do we need to do to actually build on that? And some of those individuals who had left their roles found other places to go to, who are now looking for their first CDOs in order to really move forward. But I think what this said very clearly is this is not a monetary issue. When you're dealing with the sense of belonging and the sense of connectivity and safety of your people, it's not just a nice to have. I mean, this goes hand in hand, not just with retaining your people, but with your perceptions of your brand, with what your clients and your customers are saying, with the perceptions of your board and your shareholders, and also now with government. And that is a far different role, even with companies who are so focused on D&I, than it was maybe 6 months ago. And that realization has completely changed the fabric of roles to be more inclusive of those different things and the importance of it. And I think that that was really stark in comparison to what happened in the March timeframe.
Thanks, Shannon. Well said.
And this is Allison. I was actually just going to add, I think that absolutely, I totally agree with that synopsis. And I also think that what was curious, particularly as so many companies were going through reorgs, whether it was reduction in force or furloughs, that one of the things that often happens is that there's a knee-jerk response to that. Now, obviously, there was a financial need to make some changes dramatically for many companies. And what was understood often, and in hindsight, certainly, and in some companies in that present time, was the need to have someone who was helping them understand future state, right? What happens next with who's here, who's left with this commitment that you've said that you have of creating and having a diverse and inclusive environment. And so having the ability to also, as a chief diversity officer, lean in to conversations that may not have actually been happening before, as a restructuring is taking place, was one of the sort of, I guess, a revealed opportunity to engage differently in the conversation about what we need to be paying attention to at all steps when we're thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I'm happy to build on what Allison and Shannon said. You know, I see this as going from, you know, March, April to the May, June timeframe, going from a diversity inclusion officers as nice to have, great to have, to must have. We became much more central to the mission of organizations, and I began to see more mass media news about the role and what it entails than I had seen. And, I've seen more on the front page of the Wall Street Journal around diversity and inclusion and the role that we play in the last 6 months than I had in the last 6 years. So there's something that happened, and it was, unfortunately, it took the horrific trigger of George Floyd for it to happen. But I think it created this sense of humility, of knowing that we don't know what that future is. We cannot predict. We're not, we need to have this capability to be able to be future ready. So I think, it's a role that is very different today than it was not just 6 months ago. It's been evolving consistently, but it's evolving in new directions that I know we'll talk about.
Yeah, and part of what Rip is saying, how it evolves. So it went from thinking about the strategy, what is the implementation, to also trying to coach our leaders who did not have any other space but to say, I don't have the vocabulary that I need. And it's interesting because we all have used different things. We spent a lot of time talking, was this a murder? Was this a killing? Was this a death? And people not knowing and then making a stand. We're going to refer to George Floyd as a murder because that's what it was. And are we all comfortable with that? And that's the way that we're going to have our stance as a company. So I think that even that has continued to evolve our role, and with our senior leaders who for the first time thought that they knew what we needed to do, and now they found themselves not even having the vocabulary, and I've seen this not in my company, in all the companies, and wanted to, not for the first time, talk to our Black employees, but understand and listen in a very different way than they have done in the past. And we engage with our leaders. We're bringing you to these listening circles, and we're not expecting you to fix things as we always do. Senior leaders will come here and say, we want you just to listen and take the time, and we're going to give you grace for you to learn from this process. So that has also been very important as an addition to the role, to the work that we do these days.
So thank you, Elizabeth. It sounds like you actually touched on two things that brings me into our next piece of talking about this role. It's not just having the role, it is also what are the competencies, what is required of a chief diversity and inclusion officer. And so there was some research done by Russell Reynolds last year, and they actually did a survey and inquired what are the top competencies that chief diversity officers need to have. And the set of competencies, the way that they describe them is that chief diversity officers that are successful in actually breaking through in organizations, making change happen, have these set of competencies in common. To your point, Elizabeth, they're strategic executors. They know how to take a strategy and make it happen across the organization. And in many cases, for those of us here that are working globally across the globe, being able to take a strategy and make it make sense in a different market. In addition to that, it was said that successful chief diversity officers are data savvy and storytellers. They know how to use the data to say something, to tell us where we need to go or what we're doing well. They use the data to close up what we call the say-do gap. This is what we are on paper, but this is what we are in actuality. They're known as influencers, and that they are savvy and authentic communicators. And to your point, Elizabeth, around being able to coach leaders on how do we message things, how do we have the right outreach to our employees, is the role of a chief diversity officer. You bring that lens to it. And last but not least, what I thought was really cool was they call chief diversity officers pragmatic disruptors, which basically means, and I've yet to meet in my small circle of I call a sheroes of chief diversity officers. I do have a few males in there, so I have to change the title. But I look at the common theme is we're not afraid to push. We're not afraid to challenge the status quo, maybe be the only one in the room that has to call out something that's inappropriate. And so what do you think? These are things that Russell Reynolds laid out, but when you think about the competencies that have been successful in your careers, what would you say has best served you in terms of the competencies in the role that you currently have?
I'm happy to kick off the answer to that. You know, I have a
Perfect.
I have a pretty untraditional background in terms of people coming to this field, in that, you know, in the Russell Reynolds study, it has kind of the backgrounds of people, HR, the business, et cetera, legal. I actually, you know, I have a background as my first degree is in astronomy and astrophysics, so very numbers heavy. Then I went to graduate school to get a PhD in anthropology. So that's really understanding human society in terms of frameworks and models. And then I got an MBA, finally finishing school so I can understand business, right? So I really bring all those three lenses together. And it's, I think, what you said about bringing the numbers with the storytelling that has been the common denominator across all of my professions is bringing numbers with storytelling together. And to do that well, you both have to analyze, synthesize, and I think what Elizabeth said, listen. That wasn't always part of the diversity and inclusion game, the listening as much. I think we veered much more in that direction. So I think kind of being a numbers person, but being also the storyteller and influencer.
Thank you, Ripa. You know, Elizabeth, you talked about being this trusted advisor and coach to senior leaders who are operating in a space of discomfort. Sounds, you know, that's a must-have. Are there any other things that you can think about that has served you well and others in the role of CDO?
I believe that looking at the issues as systems. So if you think about what Ripa said, looking at the data, being a storyteller, looking at the systems, because at the end of the day, what started in many of us as in D&I practitioners, what we call, you know, food and fun, you get people together, you build community, that's very important. And I'm not dismissing that, but unless we are able to change whatever systems, mechanisms, processes we have in our companies to make processes that are equitable, we're going to continue to just build community and not make any changes. So trying to articulate to our senior leaders the need to modify, update, review, inspect our systems and see what is the impact of some of the decisions that were made in a way that will be neutrally fair, but they may not be neutrally fair anymore, and continue to do that. And that's why the other piece that it's not there, but Cindy, you and I know very well, is how you build relationship across other owners of processes in your HR department, because you may not own the recruiting process, but you need to influence so the recruiting process is equitable. You may not own the performance management of the talent review. So that also, that building the relationship and using the data and the storytelling to engage with those owners of processes so they can also make the changes that you can influence.
And let me add to that, because I think probably all of us, and I don't know, Allison, but Elizabeth, like as soon as this question came, like I wrote every word down that I could think of. I'm like, and here's my list of what it takes, or so a couple of the ones that weren't mentioned that I think are important, I think we're resilient, right? This is something that, this is tough stuff. This is emotional, it is physical, it gets at your soul. And we have to get up the next morning and we have to face it, whether it's a murder, a shooting, an election, whatever's happening, we're there. And our teams have to be there. And we need to inspire them to know that their drive and what they do is so important, regardless of what they're feeling. We are the front line. And you have to show that we can do that. And I think that takes resilience and courage and agility to say, Yesterday we were there and today we are here, and people, let's rally around it because there's not that many of us in order to really look to what changes. I also think really being intellectually curious. I'm amazed at how many articles are out there around these topics. And every day you're learning new things about learning new ways in which people are claiming their identity and saying that this is the group that I fit into, and saying, what does that look like? How do we make sure that that's something that we embrace within our culture? And I never knew it was here before. And so making sure that we're looking at that, and then we're giving visibility to it, to our organizations, to people who, if we thought we might not have known, other people really don't. And so I think that ability to want to learn more all the time, because this is evolving and changing, and then making sure that we're finding ways to, as you were saying, Elizabeth, we're plugging that into all the other areas of human capital and strategy and benefit that need to embrace these things. And I think we can truly be the message carrier if we stay alert and have just that interest in learning more, because it's amazing. And Ripa, thinking about your background in anthropology, it's the evolution. Like, we're responsible for how this world is evolving, and this area just keeps on changing. And we're responsible for keeping up with that so that we can stay relevant and current, and make sure that we're supportive of the people that are working for us, who want to work for us, or the people who are buying our products.
And the only other word that I would add to this list and to what was shared, because I agree with everything that has been shared so far, is courageous, leading with courage. There are going to be constantly times that are like where you doubt yourself. And, you know, again, we are learning all the time. Shannon, I really appreciate what you're sharing, that, because I say that all the time. I learn every day. I also know that there are times where I'm going to be the person, and Cindy, you talked about this as well, that there's going to be like some reluctance to be a little bit bold. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about data, but there's having the courage of the conviction. And that's something that I often, you know, in my experience with the range of chief diversity officers that have existed over the last, 25, 30 years in this business, this is, there's a range, right? But it's a core requirement as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Some of the things that I pulled from everything the four of you said that we didn't actually say was, we are these culture stewards in a way. We're architects. To Elizabeth's point, we are coming in and leveraging all of the competencies and traits that you've talked about and more, and building something that should withstand the test of time. We don't know what the future holds. We could not have predicted last year that we would be in the situation that we're in, but as chief diversity officers, having to be agile and change and pivot. And as we are developing our organizations and building out the right systems, we have to learn, to your point. So it's this delicate balance of, you're this expert leader and you're also a change agent. And you're influencing. That's a huge part of the role. And as we start to think about the role, we know how important DEI is. The research is out there, the business case has been made. But what do you do when you are in a situation where you're faced with having to continue to prove the importance? Because I think the misinformation that people might think is, they're looking and they're saying, oh, all these jobs are posted, or, oh, there's so much in the media about chief diversity officers. It's not actually a job that's a safe one. So, you're constantly in play. I'll put it that way. You're constantly, as Brene Brown says, you're in the arena, and you're getting some wounds. Stuff is happening. So how do you navigate that as chief diversity officers, especially in the environment that we're in now? How do you navigate not just the naysayers, but also people who have all the ideas of how you can do it better, even though they've never done your job, but that they can tell you they have these insights that they want to bring. How do you deal with that?
First of all, I just want to say, like, that question, the last part was like, everyone knows how to do this better than you do. And that, so I had someone else go first, but looking at all of us, just broad smiles of, oh yeah, that's my day. I could do it better than you is a fascinating one. So somebody take that. It was just great to see everyone's huge smiles because it was.
I did create a folder, and I tell this to people in my company. I created a folder that says great D&I ideas from strangers, and there are these emails, and I appreciate because it really, many cases, it really confirms the work that we're doing is what people, but in some cases, like, we're doing this. But it also tells me that although we're doing some things, people are not really seeing it. So I take this with a little bit of a smile, but for me, it's like when they are coming up with an idea that we implement, I go like, wow, that means that it's not going through, it's not being communicated. So it really triggers me to say, I need to double down now in the communication, if I'm really doing that. And some things I can't do because, not everything can be done, but yes. So I now appreciate, and as we become more and more popular and people know who we are in many of our organizations, we're getting a lot of engagement, and I'm using that energy to really continue to get our message out. So yeah, so it was a little bit of a smile of all of us because we get people all assuming they know how to do this.
Well said. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll add on. I love the idea of the special folder, Elizabeth. I'm going to start that. But I will say that I think one of the reasons it's great to have the engagement, and I think it's a fine balance between quelling that enthusiasm, but setting the boundaries and saying, you know what, this is a profession. This is not a hobby. This is a profession that has a science behind it, that has deep expertise required. It might have, rest upon a hybrid and heterogeneous set of expertise. Not all 5 of us have very different backgrounds. That being said, we all have a lot of runtime doing this. So I think the kind of professionalizing of diversity and inclusion is something that's still happening. It's not a profession like medicine or the law, or that's known and established with a certain kind of rigor that everyone can set up, and not everyone can set up and be a lawyer. Right. But I think it's often perceived that everyone can set up and become a diversity and inclusion practitioner. And I think kind of making sure that we communicate that this is a profession, it's a science, it's a management science, it's a change strategy. The more we do that, the better.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I don't necessarily have more to add, except that I, felt like Cindy, when you said that, you were just, as on my shoulder this week.
I was there, Allison.
You were with me. This is, and I appreciate the fact that there are people who are empathetic and certainly have lived experiences that they feel will help inform certain decisions or experience the way that we organize and or structure, certain efforts in the company. Yet and still, there's a set of skills, there's a set of competencies that are absolutely necessary in order to be able to have, first, sustainability, right? To sustain the work, as well as understand and how one examines what's equitable and how we can have everyone show up in this conversation, which is critical in this work. It is not we're not chief diversity officers for a certain percentage of our companies.
Right. And Allison, so it makes me think, back to the words that we didn't use. There was part of me that wanted to use the word patient, and there was part of me that wanted to use the word impatient, because it is this really interesting thing. And Elizabeth, to what you said, like, you roll something out for a year and you get a note saying, it'd be great if we recruited at HBCUs. And I was like, oh, you mean the 50 that we do? Like, and so that's on me because you didn't hear it, right? And so I have to figure out what to do. Now, I'm also trying to see how that works. And then we also want to make sure that we become very similar to any other business unit within the organization. I don't want to do something like we've done this for 10 years. I'm not really sure how it went. We spent this money on it. Just do it because people like it. I also think we have to have the rigor to what we do to say, yes, now we're dealing with behavioral change in behavioral skill building that is different potentially than me teaching you how to use this certain application. But how do we decide how long that should take? And if it's not working, how do we evaluate it to say, now we have to move? And as any business unit, we evaluate that worked, great, let's reinvest. If it doesn't, let's dump it, even though people liked it, but it didn't show progress, and then go to the next. And have that same rigor as other business units do within the organization to really make sure that we're showing the results, knowing that we're dealing with things that take longer to get into people's minds because it's not as concrete as what they might normally gravitate towards. And so it's that constant reflection of, I want to see how it works because I'm asking someone to actually act differently and to think differently and more thoughtfully. So it's going to take a little bit more time than just I learned a skill. But then when do I decide, okay, my patience is up. Either you should have changed and I need to take on that, and or the program didn't work and let's double back. And so, I think it's a really interesting place to be in.
Absolutely. To everything you've all said, I think it's an interesting role because people do, especially our employees, have so much passion around it. Your point, Ripa, on the professionalization of D&I, I do think there's more that can be done there. And the more that people recognize, that's why the competencies, and the traits and all those things are so important. That's important work. And I would ask this future generation, that is something that you could explore if you're interested in research, if you're interested in design and taking this to the next level. It's ripe for change because I think passion is only going to get you so far. Hopefully it'll keep you in the game, but the competencies and the skills will carry you through. And it is very tough to be in a room with a bunch of senior leaders who are experts at what they do, whether it's marketing, some types of business, or they're a turnaround type leader, or they know how to take a business and make it better, and they don't know how to do this. You talk about being in the presence of frustration, and then you have to be the one to address this group. It's a daunting task, but it moved me into something that was raised by a couple of you, and that is the work that we have to do. Actually, I think all of you might have raised this in a different way. The work that we really have to undertake to change the organization is not always the flashy, fun, glamorous thing that people want to be involved in. It's not the conference. It's not the festival or celebrations of our diversity or difference. It's that tough stuff of looking through policies, looking at our practices, and trying to figure out how are we going to remove long-held, not new, long-held systemic cultural barriers in the organization. And that's the work people don't always see. So I think sometimes, in organizations, people have been used to the stuff that they can go to, the stuff that they can attend, and they're like, oh, that's diversity and inclusion. So what are you doing to make the measurements more visible? I know that people are talking about programs and things, but from a metrics perspective, how are you going about measuring success of the strategies that you've put in place in your organizations?
I'll start because I call what you were referring to, Cindy, as the big sexy, Everyone wants the big sexy.
Yeah, there you go.
The big
Yes.
sexy headline, the big sexy hashtag. And we've got, there's plenty of those. But to your point, a lot of the work is this foundation building and this dismantling. Right. And so one of the things that we're very much focused on, I focus on with, and the leaders are right there with me, is looking at like, what are we as leaders what do we want to be measured against? So at this point right now, it's less about me dictating what that is, but okay, we're all in this. We believe we understand we want to be an anti-racist allied organization. Here are some of the ways that this is what it looks like if we're doing this well. How do we get there? And what are you willing to be held accountable? And how will you hold yourself accountable? And so there are literally lists that people have like created for themselves to keep on, like, so that knowing that people get busy, knowing that like, and how do we make sure that we're embedding and integrating all of this in a constant refrain? And that then allows for us to not actually feel like the leaders are like, this is what I decided I wanted to do and be about and be held accountable for. I will do it. And I think, and it's not, and the recognition is in the praise, not in the criticism. It's those who are showing up and really being able to do it will be recognized for that. And so we're trying that on. This is not, it's a new way of doing this for us. And I'm enthusiastic because people are leaning into it. But I don't have the results yet. So I'll keep you posted.
I do have a follow-up question for you, Allison. Given the recent, you're in entertainment, and I've been seeing a lot about what the Academy is doing to make sure that there is more diversity on the creative side and behind the scenes, from diversity writers to looking at the Academy and saying, when we are nominating directors, this is we need to be thinking about this type of diversity in the director pool or best actor or actress. Has that impacted your work? Is there anything that you've taken or they've taken from you to put further into the entertainment industry?
Yeah, no. Well, first I will say that that's part of our, we're very much involved in helping with that, as well as owning some of the responsibility and accountability in parts of our company around inclusion writers. And we're also really looking at how do we, it's an entertainment company, and it's, we have a Hollywood presence. And so what are we doing, externally as well? And what we found is this wonderful way of creating this impetus for external movement with the Color of Change and Change Hollywood. And with that, there is a very, very clear commitment internally for work that has to happen, which includes looking at policies and protocols and reviewing systems that may in fact keep us from ensuring that everyone can be as successful as they should be and thrive within our company. But also influencing and supporting our clients on the WME side, particularly to lean into those writers and those inclusion writers. And
can you say more about the writers, Allison, just for our audience who I've been reading Hollywood Reporter, so that's the only reason I know a little bit about it. So can you tell us what writers are and also what the Academy is doing? And then that'll set us up for what's happening in other parts of corporate America.
Well, the writers is really an indicator of, it's an agreement of, or really a demand to ensure that anyone who is working on, and there are a number of types of, this writer sits in a number of areas, particularly of entertainment. But it began with the Academy looking at how do we ensure that we have women have access to being directors, being behind the scenes, being showrunners. The same thing with people of color. And it's actually become a template and people are building from that to ensure that and other organizations are building from that to ensure that there's access opportunities. Producers, Ryan Murphy has an inclusion rider in every show and every project that he is involved with, where he requires and insists that there is a diverse slate of crew and writers on his projects. And so this is something that is catching fire, but certainly was led by the Motion Picture Academy.
So I'm gonna do a plug for Amazon Studios because they have been doing this work for the last 2 years, and one of the things, and this is why intentions and who's leading matters. So Jennifer Solke became the president of Amazon Studio, and she brought a different intentional view of how we're gonna bring the stories, the people that tells the story, the people behind the scenes, the people in front of the cameras, and by the way, they don't always have to tell the story of the diverse person. They can tell any story. And that has been super intentional. And today we can see the kind of shows, because as you know, it takes 2 or 3 years for a show from inception to be in front of our viewers, and you can see the intentional work that they have done. So as Allison's saying, it's just a lot of people that have been thinking in the last 2 years, and yeah, the Academy can take some of the kudos of those, but there were a lot of other studios taking this very, very seriously.
Right.
And when they saw that the Academy was not doing enough to push, and we wanted to connect with in our case, it was understanding our customers, but also understanding that they were coming from their own experiences of being the only one, and they wanted to open doors to others.
And you know what, if I can also just say, Elizabeth, because one of the things that I say about the role of the diversity inclusion officer, or being in this role, is that the best cannot make the change on their own. And the amount of work and having partners and leaders like Jennifer, like Albert, like Bernie, like there's this incredible, like having this commitment of leaders across the businesses, and certainly who are also just in the conversation, understand and see what you see, right? And not being the only person with that lens and those glasses is very critical as well. There's anyone who has to show up as a chief diversity officer and like, okay, go do your job, make us diverse. I don't care how good you are.
Exactly. It's like, what?
Yeah.
But one of the things, one of the reasons I zeroed in on the writer is because I saw the similarities with diverse slate policies. And I went and looked at, to your point, Elizabeth and Allison, what studios were doing, what Hollywood was doing for language, actually. How can we be clearer, have more clarity on exactly what we're looking for, and use that also as a way to measure? Now, as I pivot over to Shannon, many of us have, Shannon, we're also part of the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion initiative that you lead. And a big piece of that is a pledge that we will not only measure, but we will share our progress. How has that initiative also shaped the work that you're doing within PwC around metrics for success and progress?
Well, it's interesting when the effort was started now 4 years ago and officially got kicked off 3 years ago. It was around not having companies share their data, right? It's around saying you got to build a culture first. Like you have to actually know this is something you want to do, and it's something that you have to get people to buy in on. Because if you just want me to go hire more diverse people tomorrow, if you want a number in a box, that's completely not sustainable. We can get a number in a box. This was about saying, what does it look like to make sure that you have a culture of belonging and equity and inclusion? And what does that look like? And the things and the prongs around it. We're having difficult conversations, having unconscious bias training, sharing best practices with your competitors, saying this is no longer a competitive issue, this is a societal issue. So if you have something good, share it. Like, don't just keep it for yourselves. And then also making sure that you were putting those best practices out really publicly, so people had the opportunity to have it. And then most recently, CEOs came and said, we also want to make sure our boards hear what's happening, and our boards need to bought into the strategy. I think we've seen, and it's interesting, within the last 6 months, we've seen a 40% increase in the number of CEOs who have signed up. So we're now to almost 1,500, because CEOs in the vast majority of those companies don't even have a CDO yet, are saying like, we have to do something, but I want to figure out what, and to be with the company of others who are going to help me to get there and not serve as the gotcha. And so what we think of it when you're talking about the transparency and the data is that's a journey we all have to be on. And so even though we've been focused at PwC for 2 decades around diversity and inclusion, we let our first transparency report go. And I think for those of you who do your first transparency report, you know the date, on August 26th, because of both the lead up as well as what came after. And that was something that was because we were ready. And we were ready to do it. And we were ready, even though we had not been before, even though in prior times we'd only disclosed 3 different things. One of them was released by another company, not even us. So 2 to 14 different indicators across representation and levels. And yes, there was a couple of things that we're proud of when we've made progress on. We showed 3-year span, but there was a heck of a lot that when you think about us focusing on it for 10 years, we should have been further along. And for us, that push to release it was, one, to show to our people that we were serious, and to show our people that we released it in a way where we could have said, like, this is staff, right? And this is managers, and this is that we showed every level, because we knew in our organization, a senior associate was going to look to see where they were and what is the demographics of their group and the promotion of their group. And that's what people should be asking. And so for us, it was a way to say, this is not the diversity department's issue, right? This is not something that we alone can solve for. This is about each day, you have tens of thousands of people that interact with hundreds of people. And if their interactions don't all go in an empathetic, thoughtful way, and subtle microaggressions are happening throughout those 100 interactions, we're never going to get to a culture of belonging, or one that our data in a sustainable way will reflect progress. And that by hopefully showing it in a transparent way and owning the things that we've done, but probably more important, owning the things that we haven't, and letting our people say, gosh, I knew that, but gosh, I never knew that. And having that conversation, and also embracing the incredible importance of our white majority, because even though our goals are focused specifically on our underrepresented minorities, if our white men can't be the change agents that I know they are and be supportive, we can't get there. So the role that everybody has to play in moving to the place we need to be is so critical. And our thought was, we got to then give everyone the information so they really know the story, and then can internalize it and be a part of the change, not just from a program and that you went to a program, but that you as a human have seen what happened in Philadelphia, and you can reach out to somebody and have a conversation. I don't have to tell you to do it. You do it because you know it's the right thing to do. And that's going to make us a better organization, because you see where we are and we can be better than that. And if we can inspire that through releasing data, then we need to figure out a way to do that. But again, I think companies have to get to a place where they're ready for it. And so CEO Action was always built on saying, we want to help to get you to a place that then when you're ready for that next step, you take it. But we're not looking for your data. We're looking for you to help each other. And I think that's been really a special thing, as people and companies have gone through these horrible circumstances and been able to pick up the phone and, you know, Cindy, and say, I don't know how to deal with this. And I don't want to seem weak, but I can't do it. Can you help me? And that's what we need. And I'm proud to be a part, and with many of you, of that organization that's trying to allow people the freedom and the space for CEOs and CDOs and CHROs to get to that point.
So I'm going to jump in. Thank you for a very interesting panel. Cindy, I'm going to jump in on the hour and suggest maybe we want to get to some of the questions from the audience. We had a number of questions that came in before the event, and we're getting a lot of
Okay.
questions that come in. So if it's okay with you, maybe Talia can kick us off with some questions to throw onto the panel. And then Cindy, you'll get an opportunity to be a panelist, not a moderator, because we'd love to hear from you as well.
If I can just, I want to wrap up this one piece
Go for it.
because I promised Professor Solange that we would be talking about the metrics. So I'm just going to wrap up and end on REPA. But one of the things I did want to quickly underscore to your point, Shannon, is the importance of transparency. And as I was working on our sustainability report this year and reached out to a number of CDOs, and they were gracious and shared their reports, there was a push. I pushed and some others for us to be more transparent. And I tell you, it has been very helpful because now people know why we're working on what we're working on. And we have conversations about what we are measuring. So through our annual survey, employee survey that we do every year, we do have an inclusion index. And this year, we actually switched out a couple of the questions to go deeper on some areas that we want to measure in inclusion. And so bringing people along, letting them know how we're doing. You asked us this, have you done anything? That was another thing. We love to ask people what we could do to make the experience better, but we weren't good at closing the loop and going back and say, hey, you said this, and this is what we've done. So Ripa, to pull you in before we take it over to Talia and she opens it up for Q&A, you come at this from a numbers perspective, as you talked about earlier. And prior to your CDO role, you've been a consultant. You've worked with me. We did an inclusion and diversity insight study last year. What would you say the role of metrics plays in our success and in our strategies?
Mm-hmm. So thank you for letting me have the last word, and I'll be quick and go back to you, Steve and Talia. But I'm, as you know, a huge believer in data driving the change in our field. But I believe in both the power of the quantitative data, which is often the lagging indicators. We can get some of the leading indicators. There's a huge value also to the qualitative indicators that we need to collect. These are things like gaps in people's aspiration, ambition, their relationship networks, their confidence in their ability to succeed in an organization. So I really spent a lot of my research time before I kind of came back to the in-house corporate role trying to quantify inclusion through those measures. And I'll finish with this, a very simple frame, because, it's a complicated set of work we do, that's obvious, but the simple frame that I think it speaks to the data is that to enlist those fellow leaders, the white men that you talked about, Shannon, the other, all the producers and the directors that you talked about, Allison, Elizabeth, all the people that you're interfacing with, we need to move people in different ways. And the three motivators for human behavior, I think, are numbers, that's the head. Second is the heart, which is the storytelling. And the final piece is accountability. And, that's the carrot or the stick. So if, different things are going to move different people. Some people are going to do things because they have to, and it's on a list and it's going to make their bonus bigger or lower. Some people are going to move it because intellectually it makes sense. Other people are going to do it because they feel it's the emotional, empathetic right thing to do. And we have to meet people where they are. And it's almost like sailing a ship. You got to figure out, sailing a boat. You got to figure out which, what to pull, what to move to navigate that person and inspire them. Allison's smiling because we've been sailing together. And I'm not a sailor, my husband is. But so the head, the heart, and the hand is a simple framework I've been using to enlist other leaders and people to come along with me and whatever works for them. If it's all three, great. If it's one of those three, great.
Thank you. Over to you, Steve and Talia.
Talia, go right ahead. Take yourself off mute and we'll be ready to rock and roll. Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you, ladies. First question. This is not an easy work and resilience is needed. how do you self-care? How do each of you manage your stress, your moments of need in order to be present for others?
Well, I'll just say I have found incredible comfort in these conversations and in hearing from my peers and colleagues from other companies. It's helpful to be in, I mean, this is what affinity groups do for people, right? They kind of refill the soul and are a place where one can just exhale. And while we're often focused on others, right? It's in the most critical times. We're having conversations, trying to comfort, trying to advise, guide, provide language support. So being able to lean back and lean into the women you're hearing from on the screen, others who are in this field, who know what we're navigating, has been very helpful.
Okay.
One of the things my son has done, and I'll actually take a picture if there's a way to send it later. So he started to write on my whiteboard, like, "Mommy, you're great," whatever, and I think your family, and especially at this time, granted, it's so crazy, and having people at home and outside of the doors, and I'm so used to traveling 90% of the time, and if I have a hard day, I'm back by myself in the hotel room and I kind of regroup. And now I realize that I regroup at home, and I regroup while I'm cooking dinner or getting breakfast or trying to read a bedtime story, and forgetting to do that sometimes. And I would say it's really interesting to see this now through like the eyes of your children, and to have him see, like, and say, "Mommy, like, you've had a hard day," or "I heard you getting loud," or "I heard, I got off a call and I wept." And like, he's so intuitive to it now, and just having someone see that, because I think when you do it by yourself for so many years, you kind of just did it. And for me, seeing somebody else see me in a vulnerable way has been really helpful to me, taking time and saying, "This is harder than I might have thought." And so these opportunities to let your guard down with people that are going through the same thing are invaluable, as is now spending time with my family who never saw me let my guard down. And now they are. And I think that's helped me to be a better person and professional too.
So Talia, I've neglected to mention that we're going to try to shoot, in respect for everybody's time, to ending on the half hour, 7:30 East Coast time. So if we can get in a few more questions, that would be great. Obviously, we can't cover everyone's questions. We'd love to, but let's see if we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Laura Langwheeler, a student at Columbia University, asks, what happens when you do all the legwork, but it goes nowhere? Why doesn't it move forward? Is it leadership? What do we do? So this is from the student perspective. So as a junior employee or as a senior professional, what do you do when your projects or your initiatives fall flat?
Well, I'm going to go back to Elizabeth in your file.
And I have another file. I have another file. And I had this for years. It's the smile day, the day that you need a smile. There are many times that you're working so hard on these big, big projects, and you forget that the impact is also in the individuals. So we collect, we did this great event, and we had all these things from LinkedIn, and we took pictures of all of those and we put it in these files, because 2 days later, we couldn't push something through. And we went back and we read the story of this Native American engineer that for the first time saw herself being seen, valued, and given a job that she thought she will never get. And I read those things. So sometimes it's that balance between these big, big mountains that we're, rocks that we're moving, but the impact of a lot of the work that we do is with individuals that today have a seat at the table. And we created those spaces. They deserve those spaces. We just open a little bit the door so they could come through. And that's how I refill myself. So it's a combination of how I refill myself and how do I find impact on the work that I do, that sometimes is not the big, big things. It's just the individual impact.
And one thing I
So
think is just really
I love
important,
that.
like there are such amazing things that people bring forward. And I guess I always feel impacted by when somebody comes to us, and I think we all feel this, one of our employees, like they have a great idea, like they have the idea, right? They have something that they've thought of and they've talked to their peers about, and you may or may not be able to implement that idea. It might not even be in the guardrails of what your organization can do. It might be something that is great for 100 people, but we're trying now to focus on things that are scalable across the organization. And so that's great for 100 people, but I can't invest in that as much as I can. And I want those people who bring that to know, like, your idea matters. Like, just because we couldn't do it, just because it wasn't one that we couldn't take and share it with everyone, like, keep them coming. I think people get demotivated if they come through and they have something and we don't necessarily pick up on it. But you think of the thousands of amazing ideas that people come through, and we're sifting through saying, what can we do? What can we do in given time and given resources and given what will work here? Because we have an idea of how this all fits together. And I just want people to know, as you come forward with things, it's not that your idea doesn't have great value. It might be that it's just not the right time for it. But keep them coming, and don't be discouraged by it or think that your diversity and inclusion departments aren't taking ideas. We are, every single day. But we also have to figure out how to stop taking ideas at some point and start actioning things and making them operational, which means we can't take on more. But I sometimes feel like that gets people discouraged, and that's the one thing I desperately don't want to have happen. And so, sorry, Allison, I jumped in. We were talking.
No. And I think that was interesting. That was an important perspective too. I was thinking, when Elizabeth was speaking, I was thinking I should have taken, some screenshots of some of the great moments. And it hasn't been that there are things that I've worked that it goes back to also, Shannon, what you were saying, which is I actually also regroup and take a look at what was is there a different approach that is necessary? It's, my mom used to say, the first no is a maybe, right? And so that's how I, approach almost things. But there's certainly there's sometimes just a way that, like, there's language that people sometimes get stuck on, or there's so having an opportunity to just go back and regroup and think about, like, well, what was it that was getting, if I think this was really a really important thing or the right thing to do, what is it that I need to readjust and reframe in order to see if we can have another go at it? So that's often what I'll do.
And I just want to add a
Allison,
little.
go ahead, Reba. I'll go after you.
Okay, I was just going to say that I think that the hardest part of being in this profession, and I don't know if you guys agree with me, one of the qualities we didn't talk about is relentless optimism. You have to be an optimist to be in this field. But I am optimistic because, we're in it for the long game. And if people like us didn't exist, think about the kind of demographic makeup of Harvard Law School when Ruth Bader Ginsburg went to law school in 1955. She was one of 9 women. Today, law schools are 50-50. Obviously, the pace of change, we want it to accelerate, but we do need to be in it for the long game. We're trying to accelerate it, but we need to be optimistic about the possibility of change and the fact that sometimes some of the change will take longer than we want it to. Even in the media industry, I was in the media industry 7 years ago, and people would say in the industry, a woman-led or a person of color-led movie in the box office was never going to make it. Look what happened in 2018, only 5 years after that. Yeah, we had Black Panther and Wonder Woman, breaking the box office charts. So things can change. Things can change in shorter time periods than the longer, the 40, 55, 60-year time period that we often need to look at.
Reba, I love that relentless optimism. I think that is so necessary. And one of the things I learned, when I worked with Elizabeth, I think we would do this a lot. Sometimes you just have to know when the timing is right. And it's not no, it might be not now, and it could be no, and then it could be you got to fold them. You got to hold them, you got to walk away. You have to know what's your idea or project and the grand scheme of things. And this is where sometimes we have to be able to really manage our passion. Because when you're passionate about your project, you might miss all the signs that were actually telling you that this is either the right moment or it's not the right moment. I brought a vendor in for the organization to consider 4 years ago. And I couldn't even get this person to get a meeting with anybody. Fast forward 4 years, this person was part of our technology program that highlights startups called Ignition. And her company is doing their very first pilot with us. Now, had I given up and taken it personally and done all of that, we would have missed out on this opportunity to be able to scale this particular the work that we're doing. So it's being objective, to your point, Allison, and that's when you need your posse around you, your community to say, am I taking this personally? And then you strategize and you come at it in a different way. To your point, Shannon, don't give up. Try it again.
Love it, love it, love it. Next question up. How have you addressed those of the opinion that your roles are not legitimate?
Who has that opinion?
I don't know. They don't.
Talia,
They're
ask a
not.
tougher
They're not.
question.
That
Allison,
wasn't
you
in
asked that one. I didn't get that one. Go.
That was imagination. I was like, that's not the real world.
Wow.
I think I understand that question in that I remember meeting with a couple of students that they were coming through an internship program, and they just point blank asked me, like, what do you do? Like, for real? Because they saw the role as, this spokesperson, like you're at the opening of every envelope, you're at the special dinners, you're at all the festivities, as you said earlier, Elizabeth, food and fun. And they didn't see, to your point, Ripa, around what this is rooted in. They didn't see that part. And we had a really good conversation about the role is what you make it. But the role I talked about what the role meant for our organization. I said, I'm not talking about what the role means for another company. I'm going to root it in where we are and what it means here. And this is what I get the opportunity to do. Left that conversation with them saying, writing it down as a potential aspiration for them.
No, that's great.
So I think, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I did laugh, and because I have not heard that. But what I will say and confess here is that I actually I never wanted this title, and I don't think I didn't want this title. Maybe it's because of what you just described, Cindy, which was an experience when I was much younger, and I was like, and people were starting to talk about diversity directors and what that meant, and what that looked like was something where, I'm looking for, what was the phrase, like pragmatic disruption, right? Like I want to see change. I wanted to see, and I wasn't seeing that. And I wasn't seeing the, in some cases, like some of the courage that I was hoping to have. And certainly where I thought there needed to be change. Now, granted, as a 20-something, where I see change and where the time frame shifts, right, as we get older. However, the reality was that I wasn't seeing that particular, and people with a similar title make effective change that I thought was going to strengthen like inclusion and provide opportunity and access. And so I was laughing, but I do understand why the question is raised. And I think what you're hearing, what people should be hearing today, especially, and it has been for, many years, is that there is an intentionality around like what can happen when having people with competency and skill and knowledge around how to affect organizational change and in an inclusive and develop inclusive culture, what's possible there. And that's, what we do.
So Talia, we're about another 8 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap. Maybe we have time for another question or two.
We have time for one more question. And this is around the executive order. What are your thoughts on the recent executive order about workplace training and materials used to train employees on DEI?
I'm laughing at this one because I think we need another like 4 hours to deal with the executive order. And frankly, we can all get together after next week or maybe 10 days after, based on when the decisions are finalized and votes are counted, to come up with that one. And all I'll basically say is there are a lot of different interpretations of the executive order that are across industry and actually across different legal entities. And I think most of us have worked with our internal counsel as well as external counsel to read the executive order and to decide what that means and what we're doing. And as you've seen, many companies, Microsoft, Starbucks, you've had the chamber, others come out to say, yeah, and you know what, like this is really important to do. And I think very few are leveraging their diversity inclusion training for scapegoating and other things that are specifically or being divisive. But it most certainly is one of those things that I think is incredibly important for us to make sure that we're looking at, make sure that we're understanding the ways in which government can get involved in this as we move forward. And then one that we need to continue to monitor, but to appropriately realize what's important to our organizations and the values that we have, to make sure that we're not taking steps backwards, but to make sure that we're being, as we've called before, courageous in our steps forward, in a way that certainly is legal, but also right. And I think it's, again, I think I spend about 4 hours a day on the executive order in various different things. And it's been more interesting, certainly, as we've gotten closer to it and as different hotline numbers have been put out. And will certainly continue until after the election and depending further on.
Okay, so one final question, and this has to do with the overall impact in the organization from the board level. How have you as a CDO impact the boards of your respective companies to drive change?
I will say that probably many of us are very lucky to have boards that actually are so committed to this work that they are pushing on us and they are the ones. So I let Cindy talk about MedLife and her experience, but I can talk about the experience at Amazon and the Leadership and Development and Compensation Committee. We meet with them twice a year and they are very involved in everything that we do. And those are the formal meetings. Now, given where we are today, they're much more interested and we engage very closely with our progress. So I have the experience of having boards that were very committed to this work before I even walk into any of those places.
Yeah, that's a good point, Elizabeth. At MetLife, same thing. I've gone before the board twice this year, and one of the sessions was focused on what we were doing around racial equity and inclusion. And it was a conversation. It was a conversation around our commitment. I let them know that the path that we took was around deepening the commitment. There were, for us, maybe there were other companies that had to do something, maybe they had not had previous relationships. And there are some instances where we said, okay, we want to start a new relationship. But for example, UNCF I shared with the board, we've been supporting them since their inception 45 years ago. What we decided to do is deepen that effort, and therefore we have the MetLife Scholars program. And they were just really supportive, asking what could they do. And I think one of the things was just that we're going to have regular touch points around diversity and inclusion. So it's been positive for me. And I think when you have the board support, it helps internally. It helps internally for me to say, I was just at the board and I said such and such and such, and they supported this, and people are like, oh, okay. It's a instant respect that you get, and people recognize, oh, the tone is really being set at the top and being supported at the top.
Any final thoughts on the last question? Steve?
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Talia. First of all, I want to, again, thank the HCM Club for hosting this, pulling it together. Obviously, a panel full of experience and wisdom and, may I say, opinions. And we certainly welcome that. It's wonderful to hear people who can take a stand on this, who can speak from a position of passion and knowledge and intent and purpose. And I think that's come across very clearly. I want to thank the audience for their attendance. We will follow up sometime in the near future with a video that we hope will be available. We'll try to make that available. We're working on that. But we welcome your continued participation in the DEI series. As I mentioned, on November 12th, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll be looking back at the elections. And I don't know, Talia's last question could be, well, what do you think is going to happen? But we don't have 6 months to spend on this discussion. And maybe by November 12th, we'll know something, who knows? But anyway, right. So again, thanks everybody to everyone around. If it's the evening for you, have a good evening. If it is as for some of our students tomorrow, well, have a good Friday and a good weekend. And we thanks very much for your energy. Cindy, not surprisingly, great job. Great job in moderating. I just want to thank you for the passion that you bring and for bringing together this wonderful assortment of leaders. So thanks, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, and thank you to the panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks. Great to see everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.